Good evening and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. Well, life is starting to return to normal, and for all of those who sent their prayers and wishes for my mother, thank you very much. Last time I produced a video, I was talking about how it's kind of difficult to align videos with a visual method and then have anything reasonable happen with the audio in terms of overlaying it. And I demonstrated by aligning 3 videos with a visual event and then comparing them. So for example, there's three videos. This is the audio, as you recall, from 3 videos. It doesn't matter which ones you pick as long as you're picking the videos that can be aligned visually and they all contain the same sound that you want to look at. And so in this case, I marked in each video where this visual event occurred, and then if I line them up with that little middle line rather, you'll see, this is just by way of review, you'll see that while they're aligned visually and all the frames would agree if they recorded the same visual event, that the audios are completely discombobulated. And so if you were to listen to these overlaid, you'd be able to make very little sense of it. And I'm going to go into great detail tonight about that phenomena and about the difficulties in aligning videos through the audio. But I made some pretty aggressive statements in the last video, and I still stick by them. And I wanted to point out that if you align audios visually, then if you align videos visually, then the audio is wrong. And if we were to try to align these things up with the audio, and I'm going to go into great detail about what that means, but let's just presume that this was in fact lining them up, then you'll see that now the visual frames will no longer agree in time. And those were the 2 major takeaways from that little pretty aggressive statement. So tonight what I'm going to focus on, though, is expand out what it really means to align audio. And you know, the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, when you're listening to things by ear, you have a limited acuity from your ears, and that acuity limits the observations you can make. The ear is not capable of making, millisecond differentiation between 2 sounds, but up here with this, I can easily make millisecond distinctions. So the ear is the wrong tool for making extremely small measurements. However, for making some pitch or timbre or other things like that on a gross scale, the ear is the perfect tool. And it's quick because, we've had it for such a long time, it's built in. So, given any audio, where does the volley begin is the first question I'd like to address. So let's take this top video and the audio from it. Where does that sound begin? Well, some would say that the sound begins where the volley begins the first time you hear it, which would be something over here. And then others would point out and say, well, wait a minute, the audio really is composed of multiple sounds per bullet, and wouldn't it really begin with the first muzzle blast? And that poses a problem whichever way you state it. In all of my work, I'm focusing on the muzzle blasts, because the muzzle blasts are the only thing that you can count on for timing, because the timing of the sounds produced by a supersonic projectile vary so greatly from bullet path to bullet path that they're all over the place. And we can see a very good example of that with these audios that I have presented here. For example, in the top one, we see that we have a supersonic crack followed by a muzzle blast, and they're separated in time by a very small distance, approximately approximately, he says. Approximately 30 milliseconds, let's say. However, on other videos, let's take this one on the bottom because it's easy to see on the third volley here. At the tail of the third burst, rather, we can see that the last supersonic crack, which is here. Yeah, right, that'll work. The last supersonic crack is there, and the last muzzle blast is there, in which case they are separated by 0.380 or 380 milliseconds. So in the first case we have a 30 millisecond separation, and in the second case we have 380. Those are huge differences. But more importantly, trying to get it back to there we go. More importantly, how you align up video sources will be entirely dependent upon aligning one or the other signals. Now this is all volley 9, just 3 different videos at 3 different locations. So when, again, I'm going to ask the question, when does the volley begin? If you take the position that I can line up the sonics and that's when the volley begins, then you'll have the problem where, let's get rid of the middle one for the moment. He says confidently and easily. Oh well, so we're not going to get rid of it. I'm having a difficult time tonight getting rid of it. Anyway, if on the third one we were to say that the volley begins at the first sound of it, outside of the fact that it's hard to tell precisely where it exists, starts, although we can see right there seems to be a supersonic crack right there. But we could align it with, theoretically with anyone. So if we were to take this last one there, and we were to take the last one in this middle, let's say there, those two look pretty good, they'll align. But then when we come up here and we take the last supersonic crack, all of a sudden we have this sound, this round of bursts, this volley ending, a substantial distance earlier than this, either the second or the third. So then you run into the problem that if you use the supersonic cracks to align things with, either at the start of the sound or the end of the sound, then the duration of the burst becomes different for each recording location. Whereas if we take the muzzle blasts, it doesn't. If we were to line up the muzzle blasts, and let's just pick the first muzzle blast of the third burst for all of them, which we have some pretty clear indication when it occurs. Okay, there we are. And then we were to zoom down so we could see it, we would observe that the muzzle blast always occurs for these 3 videos at the same place at the same time. And consequently, the length of the volley would be identical for each one of these. So using the sound produced by a supersonic projectile is extremely bad idea, and if you want to do any alignment whatsoever, because they don't preserve the time between rounds, and therefore they come in at their own little time, and you can never line them up. Oh yeah, you could get close, I suppose, if they both had extremely small lags, or they had the same lag, but by and large, extremely bad idea. So once again, just by using the ear, you won't be able to determine when the first muzzle blast occurs if you have all these other things going on. So you're at an extreme disadvantage just by using the ear. The second thing is that if you line things up, or try to anyway, by the supersonic cracks, you're going to spend all of your life trying to get them lined up, because rarely do they. Whereas with the muzzle blast, they almost always line up unless either the source or the recorder is moving. So be careful when you assert that a sound begins or ends at a certain point when you're listening to it by ear. You need a tool that gets you right down to the detail, nitty-gritty, and you need to know that you're dealing with something that has a stable timing relationship to the actual round itself, and that would be the muzzle blast. There's fewer variables in the muzzle blast than there in the supersonic projectile crack sound. Now, I think I've made the point there that, one, aligning things by ear is problematic. Two is that aligning things by the muzzle blast can be done, but once again, you're still going to have to deal with those supersonic cracks which aren't aligning. So even when you can line up all the muzzle blasts perfectly like we've done here, the supersonic cracks won't occur at the same time. And if I move this little red line, and you'll watch the bottom panel, you'll see that the supersonic crack of the first supersonic crack of the third burst occurs on the bottom panel right there. On the second panel, it occurs to the left about a quarter or 3/8 of an inch, and on the top panel it occurs, at least on this scale anyway, 1.5 inches to the left, even though all of the muzzle blasts agree. So no matter how you align these audios, you're never going to hear the same sounds on each of them. Okay? So what does that mean when you overlay things? That means you're listening to total garbage. Because no matter how you align them, either with the supersonic cracks or with the muzzle blasts, underneath, that means that one or both of them is going to be poorly represented. And in fact, it's going to sound like a cacophony of sounds. Because you'll have all these extra sounds floating around because the supersonic cracks don't come in at the same time. So I think you're starting to see my drift here. So if we can't align them with the muzzle blast, and we can't, for overlaying purposes, this is when you want to overlay one audio on top of the other. If you can't align them with the muzzle blast, and you can't align them with the supersonic cracks, and you can't align them with the visual event from the video, how does anybody align these things and make any sense out of it? My personal opinion is, quite honestly, they don't. That they're misrepresenting things entirely. And I can see it clearly with this tool. But we can also listen to it, not on this tool, and listen to the effects. And then it starts to drive home the point that maybe when people start overlaying these audios from various different videos, they not only should be more careful, but the viewer should immediately question what they're doing. And that's what I do. Every time I watch a video where somebody has overlaid things, boy, the hairs on the back of my skin pop up, and I get chills, and I go, oh God, here we go again. Now, there are some techniques that can be used, and the people who put one video in one ear and one video in the other ear, they're not distorting the signal by overlapping them. It's essentially, but they still are going to run into the same problem. The ear's going to hear a cacophony of sounds, which sounds like something totally different, because there's no way of lining those things up where it makes sense. All right. So, what's the worst and what's the best? I guess, in terms of alignment, I guess that depends upon what you're trying to do. For example, if I'm trying to figure out which video came first, then naturally I would align the signs to a common point. So I line up all these some signs there, which would be the visual alignment, and then I would take a look at this, and I would then observe that the bottom audio came in with a few more sounds ahead of the top one, which came in ahead of that. So the order of these would be the first video on the bottom, you hear the sounds first, the top one you hear them second, and finally this one you hear them third. So by aligning the things visually, I think I said this in the last one, you get a real representation of when people heard sounds. So these 3 different locations in the venue that night heard the sounds in the order that they're shown here. And that's by aligning things visually. If you want to determine, I'm not sure what if you line these things up by their muzzle blasts, then you kind of can determine which audio was closer to the bullet path, shall we say, because there'll be supersonic cracks that are heard in isolation compared to the ones that were further away from the bullet path. But it's a pretty crude measure, and I wouldn't really suggest it. I really do almost not strongly, but even stronger than strongly, almost require that people drop into something like Sonic Visualizer, where you can get a spectrogram and look at these things. And you can do this with Audacity and a bunch of other tools. It's just that Sonic Visualizer has the greatest sets of variables that can be, or parameters and settings, to help clarify what's being seen. Okay, well, enough of the theory. Let's drop over into Audacity, where we can hear these sounds being played and get a better idea of what I'm talking about. Alright, and I'm going to be making more statements. Here we go, Audacity. Now, I'm not an Audacity expert by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I'm a novice. But what I've done here is I've imported 3 audios. The first 2 tracks are identical. It's the same audio. Because what I want to talk about is what happens when we overlay sounds or mix them and produce a single stream of sound to listen to, and what can we tell by using that process. And I'm going to go through it in a way that quickly reveals the pitfalls and limitations of using this technique. Okay, so let's begin by saying that you have an identical. We want to look at it. We want to look at a volley, and we look at it on 2 different videos. But for this purposes, and to start simple, I'm going to use the same video sound so that we can get some of the basics down. So let's start by muting everything but one, and then we'll play the highlighted region here to hear what we hear, or hear what it sounds like. Okay, that's volley 9. Now, as you can hear from that, you really can hear 2 different sounds in various places, but they're pretty close together, and it almost sounds like one sound. So the supersonic crack and the muzzles are close enough together to actually start to appear to be one conglomerate sound. And what happens if we take that same video or that same audio and overlay them on top of one another with the audio precisely lined up? Now, this is one of the few times you can do this because it's precisely the same audio. So let's unmute that one and play the whole sequence again. Okay, the basic net effect is that it sounds louder. There aren't too many other artifacts coming into play. So if we have the same exact video, then we can get a higher definition. It also sounds a little more deep. But let's play it again, and this time I will turn the sound off and on while it's playing so that you can get a good idea of the difference. Okay, so indeed you can hear the difference in loudness. Well, that's all great and dandy. Now, let's take another simple case. Let's take the top sound and apply a filter which inverts the signal. Okay. And I gotta let this train go by before we do any serious listening. But basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this second original signal muted, and we're going to play the first signal, but this time it's inverted. And what do we hear? As soon as the train passes, I said. And it's going to be kind of surprising. And the reason I use an inverted signal is because every time a sound wave is reflected off the surface, it gets inverted. The positives become negative and the negatives become positive. And so when those reflected signals come back and join up with the original signal, they may be inverted, but they also may be out of phase. And I'll draw a picture here in a minute. And so the question becomes, how do those sounds combine? Well, first off, you have to know how your program is combining the sounds. And most of the programs start off by default of doing a simple, straightforward amplitude summation. And then they renormalize the signal to bring it back down into the dynamic range capabilities of the medium in its format. And so if we invert the signal and we change the positive to negative and then we add it into the positive, what do you get? Yeah, that's right. You can pretty much guess what's going to happen is that they cancel each other out, and I will show you that here momentarily. Let's just go ahead and play the inverted sound while the train is going on. Should still hear it. That pretty much sounds the way it did. In isolation, an inverted signal sounds nearly identical to the original signal. And boy, this is a long train going by. And it's coming to the end. Choo choo choo. Okay, there we go. Let's play the signal again. Okay, that's the inverted one. Now let's put the regular one back in and play them together. Nothing. They cancel each other out perfectly. Okay, and I'm going to play it again, and this time I'm going to turn on and off the second signal. Okay, so now we understand that when you take one signal, invert it, and you add them together at precisely the same time, they cancel each other out. We can also get some funny business going on if we change the amplitude of one or the other, because without identical amplitude, there's going to be some residual. So if we do the same thing where they're both on and they cancel each other out, but we change the amplitude of one, then we can begin to get the signal again. Okay. Similarly, if we change the balance left to right, what do we get? You can get something equivalent, only not as loud. So all things have to be lined up precisely to get complete cancellation. Well, that doesn't happen very often. But what I wanted to bring to your attention is that echoes and reflections and reverberation don't always add up to a larger signal. Quite often, the echo signal will cancel out part or a major portion of the original signal, depending upon how loud the reflection is and how mixed the frequency of it is, because each frequency will get reflected in a slightly different fashion, and what is cancellation for one frequency is not cancellation for the other. That is, the wavelengths change. The longer the frequency, the longer the wavelength, and therefore it has a greater opportunity to cancel out with itself, as does a shorter frequency, which has a smaller probability of canceling out because it's got less time to meet itself before changing. That's kind of a vague thing, but we'll get to it. All right. So we've talked about cancellation. Let's put our original signal back into that, so that when we play these things together, we get a double loudness. All right. So, what happens when we try to align these signals? Well, if we were to take these two identical signals and we were to shift one by, let's say, the delay in time at which it was heard, that is, we're going to align two videos, and one video and the sounds in one of the videos records the sound, say, 1/10 of a second or 2/10 or 3/10 or whatever later. Let's just pick a number here, and let's say it is 2/10 roughly. And now let's listen to the sounds. Okay. In this case, when we we align the videos visually and synchronize them with a visual event, then the audio becomes unsynchronized and overlays in a way that provides any information to us whatsoever. Because for this video, which used to have 2 gaps, it has no gaps when viewed from the perspective of the bottom signal. Because every time there's a gap here in the bottom signal, there's sound coming in from the top signal. So, somebody comes along and tells you that they've aligned the videos with an event that was common to both visually, and they said, now let's listen to what happens to the audio. You better tell them you already know what happens to the audio. It gets hosed, it gets scrambled, it gets shifted, and even more things than that. Because some of these signals up here, even though they're still in their original form, because of the alignment process now, the positive and the negative portions of them meet and they cancel each other out. But overall, you basically are now on average getting about twice as many sounds per second as you did with just one. And if you thought there was difficulty understanding just one audio, try it with 2, 3, 4, and 5 audios overlaid together. Okay, so we took an example where we aligned them at a large scale. Aligned these things visually, and it threw the audio alignment off completely. But what about if we lined them up more closely? So, in this case, what we're going to do is take them, and we're going to line them up such that there's only a small deviation between them, like a millisecond or 2. So the first supersonic crack is aligned up with a difference of, let's say, 1 or 2 milliseconds, and similarly for all the remainders. Now what does it sound like? And we're going to play them both at once. Starting to sound like a little bit deeper and richer, and it's starting to sound like there's an echo. So let's go ahead and let's play that again and turn one off while it's happening. So you can hear that it's starting to sound like you're hearing it down a pipe, which is the beginning of echo and reverberation. So now let's do that same process and increase the distance. So in this case, what we're going to do is align it so it's, let's say 5 milliseconds apart. And we'll play them again. Okay, and then we'll play them again, only this time I'm going to turn again the second one on and off. Now, everybody's going to hear something slightly different because our ears are all tuned differently, but I'm still hearing essentially the same single stream of sound but with a big echo. Other people may hear different things. So let's increase it even further to where now the first supersonic crack on the second signal has been aligned such that it splits the difference in time approximately with the first muzzle blast. So on the top signal we have a supersonic crack and a muzzle, and now we've aligned the signals to where we have the first supersonic crack of the second one coming right in the middle of there. And let's see what that sounds like. Alright, and once again I'm going to play it and then turn the second one on and off. Okay, I did the first one wrong. This is when they're both on. Let's do that again. I had one off the first time. They're both on. And now let's do that again, only this time I'll oscillate them on and off. Okay, it sounds to start like a really big echo now, only it also starts to sound a little confusing. That is, it's not clear whether there's one or two sounds every time you hear something. So let's increase the distance even further still. Let's increase it to where the supersonic crack from one of them is aligned to just before on the other side of the muzzle blast, and see what that sounds like. So now we're starting to approach, half the distance between rounds, so on the order of 0.08 seconds, 80 milliseconds. Okay, now it's a completely different thing. Now it sounds like we've doubled the frequency of firing. It still sounds like one gun, but firing at twice the rate. So now each of these times involve slight adjustments to the alignment of them that are so small that it would be trivial to do that when you're lining the audio up. So if you're not extremely careful, you can produce 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 different sound effects by a simple error of 1 or 2 milliseconds, or 10 milliseconds, or 50 milliseconds. So let's go back and try another little experiment. This time what we'll do is we'll line up the first muzzle blast with the first supersonic crack and see once again what it sounds like. Sounds like we replaced our AR-15 with an Uzi almost, except they're not the right sounds. So, I hope you're starting to see the problem by aligning these audios, in that even if you try to do the right thing, you can easily mislead people because the sounds don't do what common sense says. And it gets 1,000 times worse when we take signals from a different recording location, because they're truly different. So for example, instead of using identical signals, let's mute that one. We still got the top one, and then let's bring in the bottom one. And there's no true way of aligning them. Remember, I talked about that. But let's try our various experiments on lining them up and see what happens. So the first thing we'll do is try the 2/10 experiment, where we lined up the visuals, audio, the videos visually, and correspondingly the top and the bottom one now are misaligned by 2/10 of a second because of where they're recording. And let's hear what we hear. Oops, I got it muted. I'm sorry. You're only hearing the top one. Alright, let's unmute the second one and play that. So now we have two signals going in, each from a different recording location. We aligned the videos, and what do we hear? Wow. I don't know about you, but I can't make out what's happening. And in fact, the sound from this pristine signal at the top almost gets consumed by the background noise of this third thing. And that brings into another question. How do we adjust the volume on these such that there's any hope of attaining a reasonable result? Because all the people talking here produces a fairly large signal, which up here the people talking was a pretty small signal. So these two recordings are recorded on a different scale. That is, they're different cameras, and they recorded gunshots as being about half scale, and this one, 3/4 scale, and this one up here about 3/8 scale. So naturally, when we mix them together, this one's going to dominate. So even to begin to get a reasonable approximation, I'd have to try to make these sounds over here of people talking be approximate volume as to those. Now let's see, I don't know if Sonic Visualizer doesn't do it. It doesn't scale these things accordingly, but I upped the sound pretty good on the top one, and let's play these two together again. Now, in this case, you'll notice that in the gap up there, where there should be no sound, we hear these down there. Similarly, when this one is already ended, we still have these sounds playing. Let me play it again, and you listen, you watch the screen and listen at the same time. Now, I don't know how anybody can make any sense of that whatsoever. Because over here, You have people talking when there's gun firing at the top, there's no gunfire at the bottom, and then where there's no gunfire up here, you still have people talking, and there's no gunfire on these. You have gunfire down here. When there's no gunfire here, you have gunfire, and finally, after the first one ends, you still have gunfire going on from this third one. So trying to decipher that with the ear is not possible. But let's try a little experiment. Let's try to line up all the muzzle blasts the best we can and see what difference that might make. First problem is you have to find the muzzle blasts. Well, that's kind of hard here, but let's see if there's a segment where it would be easiest. Yeah, I think the tail end of these would be the easiest to align. That one I don't care about. So let's try and line up the muzzle blast there. Let's see how good a job I can do. Bring this little ruler over. There we go, pretty good. Okay, so now we got the muzzle blast on the top and the muzzle blast on the bottom pretty reasonably aligned. Now let's play it and see both of them together and see what it sounds like. Okay, now you run into what I call the Brian Shields effect, because we now have aligned the muzzle blast, but because this third one is at a location such that there's a larger lag, you actually hear supersonic cracks during the empty phase up there. So listen carefully when the cursor goes across that region. I'll play it again. And so you should have heard it. Again, it occurs right in this gap. Let's see, I guess I can make that bigger so we can emphasize it. Well, here we can just see it. On the top one, you have this gap, but down here you have supersonic cracks coming in. Now we align the muzzle blasts. Okay? So if we were to try to align the supersonic cracks, we would get the inverse problem. Okay. So rather than going on with this exercise in futility, it should be readily apparent to anybody with any common sense that there is no good way to overlay audios and mix them and come up with one audio stream that makes much of a sense anywhere. Now, if you want to claim that you can find any extra shots between rounds, you're going to have to first prove to somebody that they didn't exist in the first place, and then you're going to have to prove to somebody that you did the mixing in a way which would actually identify the sound. And aligning the audios visually doesn't cut it. If you can't identify the supersonic cracks or the muzzles, then you have no way to line them up except by arbitrarily lining them up. And as you can see from the little experimentation that I did here, even changing the alignment by a few milliseconds has radically different effects on what you hear. It goes from a nice little fullness to echo to down the tube sounds to all of it. Now you have twice as many shots, and some shots are not being heard, and blah 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 blah. So all these artifacts, when you overlay these audios, produces nonsense. And that's the takeaway I want people to get from this. And then if we throw in on top of it the fact that there's cancellation coming in from potential reflections, there's more complications. And you have reflections from the supersonic crack, you have reflections from the muzzle blasts. You can get up to 2 or 3 or 4 reflections depending upon how many surfaces there are nearby, and the next thing you know, you got something which is incomprehensible. And just taking one audio by itself, even with the tools I use, is an extremely difficult process to come up with a a not a correct interpretation, but any interpretation that is reasonable. So I think I'm going to stop the video there and review it, and summarize by saying that if you align the videos visually, forget coming up with anything reasonable. If you align the audios by themselves, you throw off the video alignment, and you can produce all these artifacts that lead your viewers or anybody listening to hear something that's not really there. And the only method that I use to listen to these things is by one signal at a time. And every filter that I apply, let's say I want to apply a filter to just listen to the muzzle blast, that affects the integrity of the analysis. Sure, I can emphasize just the muzzle blast by running a low pass filter, but then, for signals which are very far away from their source, everything starts to be low pass. That is, a supersonic crack heard at 2,000 feet away starts to sound very much like a muzzle blast. So you can see that there's a lot of a give and take in these things. But anyway, before getting off into the weeds, just remember that anybody pretending that they have aligned anything and that they can do anything by listening to it is once again out to lunch. All right, we'll talk to you next time on more technical subjects. This is Vegas October 1 Sounds out for the evening.